The presupposed geologic timetable. I've heard people mention this lately. One guy in the locker room with the wife talk about the hard and fast rule of geology. I said, well, there's one book that verifies the consistency of how things happen from the beginning of Earth till the time today. He says, oh, one book? Geology book? No, the geology books contradict one another. The rock systems of geology and their corresponding geologic ages have for many years been worked up in the form of an erroneous geologic timetable. Such a presentation obviously indicates a gradual progression of life from the simple to the complex, from lower to higher, and therefore implies organic evolution. This is considered by geologists to be a tremendously important key to the interpretation of geologic history. Modern biologists, in turn, regard this presupposed and falsified geologic record as the cornerstone of their hypothesis of organic evolution. It is common to read statements in biologic literature to the effect that although modern biologic research has been unable to agree on the method by which evolution is brought about genetically, or to provide examples of evolution occurring on any large scale today, it is nevertheless proved to be a fact by the paleontologic record. That's their estimation. Evolution of the animal and plant world is considered by all those entitled to judgment to be a fact for which no further proof is needed. But in spite of nearly a century of work and discussion, there is still no unanimity in regard to the details of the means of evolution. Richard Goldsmith. It is true that nobody thus far has produced a new species or genus by macromutation. Micro, yeah, but that's within the species. It is equally true that nobody has produced even a species by the selection of micromutations. In the best-known organisms, like Drosophila, innumerable mutants are known. If we were able to combine 1,000 or more of such mutants in a single individual, this still would have no resemblance whatsoever to any type known as a new species in nature. And the following quotation indicates the emphasis the evolutionist places on his false interpretation of the fossil record to largely prove out his false model of evolution. They're just like politicians, geologists, politicians, and religious people. Although the comparative study of living animals and plants may give very convincing circumstantial evidence, fossils provide the only historical documentary evidence that life has evolved from simpler to more complex forms. Carl O. Dunbar. In actuality, the fossil record proves that all life is complex, with many similarities shared among species, and all species living contemporaneously. Now, the very first geological rock strata, Cambrian rock strata, all forms of life are right there at once, simple to complex. Miniature, small, because they're lower on the level physically than the other geological strata. The most spherical and dense, and usually that's the smaller species forms, are there, but all forms of complex mammals, shellfish, to the least complex. These quotations from outstanding evolutionary authorities, both in geology and biology, demonstrate the great importance of the paleontological records to the theory, the model, really, of evolution. It's not a theory. It doesn't have any evidence that supports it. It's just a model. In turn, the principles of evolution and uniformity are seen to be of paramount importance in the correlation of the geologic strata. These principles are absolutely basic, both from the point of view of the history of the development of modern geology and of that of present interpretation of geologic field data. the circular reasoning here should be evident, and indeed it is evident, even to the many historical geologists. For example, R.H. Rastell, lecturer, Economic Geology, Cambridge University. It cannot be denied that from a strictly philosophical standpoint, geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the remains of organisms that they contain. That's kind of circular reasoning, you think? Rastell article. It is maintained by many stratigraphers, individuals studying the origin, composition, succession, and distribution of rock strata, that other factors, especially that of superposition, layered positions of the strata, are also important in geologic correlation, and that in general these factors justify the usual assignment of ages to strata on the basis of their fossil contents. The usual situation, however, is that only a few formations are ever superposed in any one locality, and that it is very difficult or impossible to correlate strata in different localities by this principle of superposition, because there's a variance everywhere you go in the world. There's not a perfect correlation of where the rock strata should be from another part of the world. The fossils must be resorted to, and the fossil sequence is falsely assumed to accord with the principle of evolution. Furthermore, even where superposed strata are exposed, it rather often happens that the fossils appear to be in reverse order from that demanded by the evolutionary history, which paradox is commonly explained by the assumption without proof that the strata have been folded or faulted or out of their original sequence. I think I remember along a long highway in Pennsylvania, the rock strata was out of order, so they talked about superposition, or uplifting rather. But there was no debris. It was like 100 miles or so of rock strata out of position. Oh yeah, something came up and lifted it up like this, and the other thing fell down and went down on top of it, but with no violence. And it was a very thin line. You got to be out of your mind to say that. Have to come up with a better explanation than that, be plausible. But no, they don't. They get people to believe them, so what do they care whether they're really provable or not, or logical? Consider the statement by Schuchert and Dunbar. In any particular region, the sequence of geologic events is clearly shown by the order of superposition and of undeformed sedimentary formations. The evolutionists, by the use of the word undeformed in the context above, indicate that they only consider formations as normal which do not contradict the order indicated in their falsified geologic timescale established and upheld by themselves. The other formations, which are innumerable, they classify arbitrarily and falsely as deformed. So you got more exceptions than the rule. Actually, they are not deformed at all, but are an expected sedimentary deposit of a flooded condition on the Earth, which goes by what? Sphericity and density. Of course, there are many places where the succession has been locally inverted by folding or interrupted by faulting, but such exceptions will betray themselves in the evidence of disturbance and in the unnatural succession of the fossils. However, this is not the case. Evidence of disturbances are not found when fossils so frequently occur out of the expected order. Consider what Schindewolf says. The sedimentary rocks by themselves, however, do not yield any specific time marks, setting aside the old law of superposition, which can provide relative age indicators only in a restricted manner, and which is unfit for age correlations. Moreover, it may be misleading in some cases. The beds in a section may be overturned, or, owing to a hidden thrust plane, older beds may overlie younger ones. The only chronometric scale applicable in geologic history for the stratigraphic classification of rocks and for dating geological events exactly is furnished by the fossils. Owing to the irreversibility of evolution, they offer an unambiguous timescale for relative age determinations and for worldwide correlation of rocks. Schindewolf goes on. That's what he said. In other words, I say this, In other words, the geologic and fossiliferous formations in real life hardly ever conform to the falsely fabricated geologic timetable to the evolutionists that appears in so many textbooks. So they resort instead to arbitrary and false assignments of specific ages to specific fossils without any proof, never considering the possibility that all life forms were created in the beginning. Of course, evolution has been around a very short time considering how long the Bible's point of view has been upheld. The basis for the apparent great strength of the present system of historical geology is here clearly seen. Provision is made ahead of time for any contrary evidence that might be discovered in the field. Just in case it doesn't appear that way, here's what happens. Wow, really? The geologic time sequence has been built up primarily on the tacit assumption of organic evolution, which theory in turn derives its chief support from the geologic sequence, thus presented as actual but not real historical evidence of the process. Fragments of the sequences thus built up often appear legitimately superposed in a given exposure, but there are never more than a very few formations exposed at any one locality, occupying only a small portion of the geologic column. Formations from different localities are integrated into a continuous sequence almost entirely by means of the principle of organic evolution. And when, as frequently occurs, strata are found superposed but with the fossils in the inverse order, this paradox is resolved by saying, well, that the strata must have been inverted though through faulting or folding, whether or not there is any physical evidence thereof. Of course, how come the fossils don't follow the record of the rocks? When superposed, strata are found with intervening systems missing, and this is explained by the assumption of a corresponding period of erosion rather than deposition. This neatly packaged system of lies of geologic interpretation has the effect of making it practically impossible ever to dislodge it by any amount of contrary evidence. You want to go to Geology 101, you better not disagree with evolution. The claim is merely made by evolutionists that it is possible to interpret geology in terms of slow processes acting over long periods of time, but that it is not necessary to do so. Not that it is necessary to do so. One may, in fact, read at length in Lyell and in words of the other early uniformitarian geologists without finding more than essentially this claim. Uniformitarianism, in other words, has simply been assumed, not proved. Catastrophism has simply been denied, not refuted. But as a matter of fact, it is not even true that uniformity is a possible explanation for most of the Earth's geologic formations, as any candid examination of the facts ought to reveal. Well, there's a little chart here. Let me just move this out of the way. I've disappeared off the planet. Look at all these estimated years. Well, it's a fictitious chart. So we can bypass this and finish up